to work with when they're writing. So that brings me to the end.
Thank you, Kira. This was amazing. Of course, very, very
Thank you. Yes.
Everybody. If anybody has a question here. Yes, Paul.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. A tremendous help. I'm using your book in my class. It gives me finally a book that allows students to have a language to talk about character, which never was always vague before. I have a question about, in your book, you talk in a bunch of different ways about how characters transform, the slow way, the different stages in life, all very interesting. What do you think of Scrooge and A Christmas Carol? Would that be first of all, it sounds like the pattern of a person who's got one set of behaviors, and then he has this intense emotional experience, and then he's transformed. So it follows that exactly. What do you, is it from a psychological viewpoint, is this guy going to just retrench back to his old ways? You know, is this really a change? I'm just curious generally, because this is the classic model that we talk about, go through an intense experience. And I'm just wondering, is maybe medication would have been more profitable for him? Do you see that in psych? Is Dickens onto something, or how was that? How do you feel about that?
I think that's a very amusing question. I think he's changed for good. I've never considered actually that he was going to revert. I was convinced by that. I haven't read the book for a very long time. I haven't seen the film for a very long time. I think my daughter was involved in the play more recently, and so that's my strongest memory of it. Yeah, what do you think?
Oh, so it does happen. I mean, what I like about your approach too is that it prepares students for observing life. You know, it's about life. It's not just about imitation of stuff they've seen. So I'm always interested in these assumptions about people that they can change. And I mean, I never thought of it before. I thought, sure, I believe it. But as I grow older and experience more, I do wonder, because you see people that can't ever change, and a guy whose behavior was so extreme that you wonder. Anyway, that thought I'd throw it out there.
That's a great question, isn't it? I suppose also when we really trust in a writer, we're absolutely carried along with that character, and it's sometimes only later that we then reflect back and their own experiences in more depth and wonder. Thank you.
We have Jackie.
I was just thinking about first impressions and character. Read somewhere that when we meet a new person, it takes like just split second for us to form a first impression that is really, really hard to change when it comes to core character. Still, we want people, and I just supervised a script by a student. She wanted to lead the audience up the garden path and change impression of her character 3 times actually. So I just wonder your thoughts about how to go about to change the impression of a character without ruining the character, and how we actually change in a script that.
Okay, 3 times, that's a lot. That's really interesting. So yeah. I think it's a fascinating thing, absolutely fascinating thing to do when we discover new evidence that we hadn't considered before that sheds light on a character. I think that moral distancing is a useful consideration in relation to doing that at least once. So so moral distancing, I'm going to use the ancient example of Sideways. Moral distance is when we've grown to like a character and then they do something we don't approve of. So in Sideways, we see protagonist Miles go upstairs and take money without asking from his very elderly mother, and it's just wrong, and we don't feel good about it, but we distance ourselves for a period of time, and then are okay with, we forgive them like we would with a friend in real life, likely, because we don't always approve of those acts. So I think moral distancing is a short-term change in our feelings about a character. I mean, if she can pull it off 3 times, then that's great. It's going to be obviously down to the writing. I think it's a really interesting thing to do in terms of engagement, and it will be about presumably presenting new facts that we hadn't considered before. So we've been taken in some way, we discover things. Is that the approach?
Yeah, and she actually used 3 different strategies there, and one was moral distancing, and she used others' impressions. At the moment, I don't remember the third one, but I also was thinking about the big 5 here, how the possibility to change is possibly, I don't know here, affected by what kind of strength there is in the various dimensions, and how perhaps is it the case that some of these dimensions are harder to change your impression of?
Well, agreeable, I don't know. I'm just thinking out loud.
Yeah.
Agreeableness is about our relationship with other people. So I think that would be a particularly salient one to consider. And that's going to be about really impact our feelings, isn't it? The degree to which a character is more agreeable or disagreeable. But I think that depending on what we find out contextually that excuses things or doesn't excuse things, that can create a big shift in the way that we perceive a character and we feel about them. I think that's just a really interesting and great thing that your student is attempting to do. So I'd love to hear if that works.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
I'm sorry.
That's okay. We have just James that is waiting patiently there. So James Napoli, if you want to come.
Thank you, Kira-Anne, for that. I think all writers are just inherently interested in the way the mind works, and so this is really fun. When you teach it this way, my question is, do you show scripts, show films or read scripts about these characters? Like I saw the stills of some of the characters in the films like Birdman. Do you use them as guideposts? And if so, or I guess if not, or if so, is there a stopgap measure wherein you can make sure that students aren't just saying, well, oh, I see what he's like in Birdman, so I'll write a character like Birdman. Are there ways into showing the examples, but also getting the authentic voice out of the writer?
Okay, yeah, great question. So I use lots of examples. So I use lots of visual examples as well as screenplay excerpts, because if people haven't seen the film and they simply see a face, it's quite likely, or an emotion, they're quite likely reacting to it and getting an idea, even from a still. And then I'll dive deeper into screenplay pages and look at how these things are revealed within the screenplay. But yes, so does that... Well, I think that they're thinking about so many parameters here that, I mean, maybe they've seized Birdman and they're taking that away with them. That's the only thing they're taking away with them from my session. But they're having to think about so many parameters that I'd hope that by the time you think about so many things, it becomes more uniquely yours. I don't feel, so students that I've worked with, or writers, not necessarily, writers that I've worked with for longer, I don't feel when I've worked with them for longer that their work is derivative. But I think it is a good question. But I still think we need to illustrate using those excerpts, using those clips. It's something we have to do to show how this can be applied into practice.
I totally see that. And when you made that distinction between writers and students, I was thinking mainly of very early on students who might, just glom onto something and try to replay it, as it were. But
I've taught modules. I've taught character development modules to first year BA students, as well as master's students, and then people working in the industry. And yeah, I'm going to say first years. I think, you know, it's a bit of a struggle to get their heads around. They're taking on a lot of things. We're already thinking about probably structure at that point and so on. So to go into much depth in character development, I feel seems too early at that point. Third years, master students feels much more appropriate, and they're able and ready to think more deeply about, in my experience, characterization. But I think when I've previously probably given too much in a semester on just character development in the first year, I haven't seen that reflect. They understand it and they're interested in class, they really do, but I haven't seen that reflected in, you know, wonderful characterizations in their first year and the pages, unfortunately. Does anybody have an approach to solving that in the first year?
In my case, the core and paradox method that I developed, it is intentionally for the BA, really, because I found that, just like you, I mean, I use your book, but I use it mostly for master students or third year when they go for the grad films, right? Because they get somehow overwhelmed because there is structure, there is this, there is that. So, and especially also because they create short films.
Exactly.
And short films are a completely different animal, right? I mean, in the future, you have the time to develop a lot, and it is much more, in a way, it is softer on the audience because you spend more time with the character, you are led. A short film is so, you know, it's so brief, it's so sharp that sometimes I have students that come to me and say, well, I didn't realize I have to work so much on building characters. I mean, is it 8 minutes film? Do I need to do all this? So, yeah, that's why it came out basically as a methodology, but just a method, not a methodology, just because of the difficulties that you very well illustrated, of course. Yeah. Anybody else?
I use the book with freshmen, you know, 18-year-olds, and what I do is they're supposed to do sketches of people they know, so that it isn't going to be derivative. I give clips of how different characters are expressed through action, but they're supposed to describe the most ambitious person they know and talk about it in terms of the dimensions and also the dark and light triads. And so that, and then, yeah, those are 7-page scripts. If you have a character, I've had students write some hilarious stuff, like a younger brother who was just a monster. You know, he was a psychopath, and the way he was manipulating the family in a 7-page script, it worked. So that's been my experience.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
Yes, Eugene, yes.
One of the things I present to students is, well, it's really a question about realism, because stories are realistic, are not essentially realistic. What happens is they're artifices and constructions, and what stories are doing is not creating necessarily realistic pictures of what we think people are, but what society wants people to be and how it wants society to understand people. So they're not realistic. They're you know, there's good people, bad people. But so there's a question whether you think this model is valid. So I present it. There's different psychological levels of character. There's mythic characters who are quite simplistic. There's social characters who are working within an institution. There's dramatic characters who I would put within interpersonal relationships, which I would see where your character banding is. But then I would say intimate relationships, which are much more like real life, where you don't actually know characters and you don't understand their motivations because it's not so clear how they're articulating. So different levels of realism in terms of how a story works, and personality being revealed in different ways and structured in different ways according to the type of story. I suppose as an example of what I do to try and put it as a bedrock, I say chess. The pieces in chess move according to a set of rules, but you call it a queen and people say, oh, it acts like a queen, but in fact it doesn't. It's not true. It doesn't behave like a queen. And Bishop doesn't behave like. So I think it's perfectly valid the social level, but I think stories work in slightly more layered ways.
I think that we can. I know there's been a lot of pushback historically against psychologically realistic approaches towards character development, but I think that, yeah, I certainly wouldn't. I'm never prescriptive, and clearly some stories have very stylized characters at their heart who certainly aren't based in any way on or based in. They are based, of course. All of our experience is based on our psychological realism, but they're far more removed and stylized. But I think arguably we are shifting closer and closer, and particularly with high-end television, towards characters that are feeling more and more realistic. We talk about them as though they're real. We feel that they're real. I'm completely enthralled with Succession at the moment. I have plenty of chats with friends about every episode of Succession, and there are very few moments, I can't remember any moments that I've been taken out of the story and thought, I don't believe that. So yes, they're bad characters, but they're nuanced as well, and complex and interesting. And I think that that's the way that we're moving, because I think that those more, gripping, the more time we spend watching those characters on our screens, and as well, the more time we watch all the reality shows, and the more time that they take up on our screens, people are watching those as well, that we are more attuned to what feels real. So I still really stand by that approach, and far more.
I think it's really a question of whether it undermines my moral. I mean, the point in terms of jumping out of character, when I was watching Banshees of Inisherin, I thought of the female character, everybody said was well written, but she's a contemporary character. She's not in 1923. And I was wondering how period, because they've given them a certain character but it's not within that period. And I was wondering if that situation defines character, as opposed, because you've got characters sort of acts as a hub within the environment, as though it's moving independently, but not really tied down within that environment. So in terms of class or religious affiliations or groups,
it's difficult context, isn't it? So one of the things that I mentioned that I will always ask writers to consider is, what is the context? Context changes everything. Context changes behavior, and so we see some huge, great shifts of character in Banshees of Inisherin because of the contextual changes, the relationship changes, things breaking down. As you say, it feels like it's a period story to some degree, because it's on this small island and so on. But that, I think that's taken into account in this model.
Thanks very much. I mean, I haven't used the terms. It's very, very useful. Thank you.
Pleasure. No, thank you. Really interesting question. Thank you.
I think we have Jahim who comes in now.
I was just thinking about what Eugene said and Kira's answer here, that James Phelan wrote something like, the difference between characters and human beings is that the characters are made with a purpose, which says a lot about his religious beliefs, I guess. But and he and I too like to have a thematic approach, and I think in terms of reliability and validity, those fantastic big words that we use in science, the realism of a character actually builds the validity of the thematic argument a lot. Without that realistic approach to a character, the thematic approach and the message, that's what is so fantastic, I think, with Succession, because it's not just a story about a character, it's about our contemporary society and the way we are as human beings thematically. and uses the realism to build that credibility of the argument, I find.
I think you're absolutely right. I think that that also comes into the truth of it, doesn't it? It feels that if the theme feels more truthfully expressed, it feels more poignant. And I think there's something about that in relation to character realism. I'm sure that theme can be expressed also through much more stylized characters and be very clear, and it's another way of going, but it must always feel more pertinent and emotional and poignant and resonant when it's truthfully, realistically expressed within the characters, I would have thought.
All right, I think that Danica has one hand up.
Yeah, well, thank you very much again, Kira-Anne. I always find super interesting what you're doing, so thanks a lot for that. I was wondering whether you could elaborate a bit more on, so you touched upon that, but I was curious to hear a bit more on how much how you use personality traits for character change, because as you said, actually they don't tend to change that much in people, but over a very long time span. And so do you focus more on motivations changing, beliefs changing, and perhaps less on personality traits changing? Or are there elements in personality change traits where you'd say, no, that works for change as well? Or yeah, how do you?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I think that in terms of transformation, we do tend to cheat a little bit in screenwriting. We compress what can happen over a shorter period of time, particularly movies. Obviously, long-running TV series, we have much longer to allow characters to transform. But I think it feels like it works, and we accept that it's a compression. So because we can and do change our personality traits over lives, and particularly with those intense events, and since many particularly intense events tend to happen in
yeah, okay, I see.
So no, I absolutely, I think we look for those personality changes in characters, and those go in line with, so for example, overcoming the flaw. I've talked about the flawed belief and how that also tends to go hand in hand with traits that go along with it. So these things change in tandem, and motivations, worldview. So these things change in tandem, and I think that's a helpful way to think about it.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Thanks.
What's your insight into that? Because I know that's obviously your background.
Yeah, well, I focus more on motivations in terms of values, but beliefs and the flaw, that's the bit I really want to work on after my PhD, because that's really crucial, I think. And because there are, of course, many different, I mean, I focus on the want and need, but the motivators, of course, can be different psychological constructs. And while I focus on values for now, of course, I do think beliefs always, beliefs always play a role. But personality traits, I just teach them kind of as one additional tool, but I'm kind of, wondering whether there is another way or kind of, how to use them perhaps differently of it as well. But
I think it goes hand in hand with, if you think about a flaw-driven approach, then, and something in a backstory, obviously in relation to we've got genetics and a backstory, is some big wounding event in a backstory that's created a flaw, and those coping mechanisms that, evidence suggests that those events in a backstory will have likely enhanced traits as well, so that the belief will go hand in hand with stronger traits, maybe aggression, assertiveness, with somebody that's learned that it's safer to lash out first than wait to be,
I never thought of that. Yeah, that's really interesting.
It goes with traits as well. So I think that's a useful way of thinking about it. And then it's an emotion that goes with that, and that could be anger, and those things are carried along together. So when we then take that approach with these three things, beliefs, traits, and emotions, are carried along in the personality, and then they go through the big events of the film that start to or the TV series that start to transform them, then we expect to see shifts in all of these at those.
Yeah, I see. No, that's really interesting, because in terms of emotions, I kind of think more in terms of a short-term reaction, and then you kind of use those for each moment as a reinforcement of behavior or not, and so on. But of course, you also have these long-term tendencies and emotions which are typical for certain neuroticism or so on. So yeah, I see. That's really interesting. Yeah, thank you. That's kind of...
I think it's also quite a useful practical tool as well. I found that quite a helpful one.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Thank you.
Pleasure.
We have Paul, I believe. Yes.
Yes, unless somebody else wants to talk. I have an observation that it took you 31 minutes to get to the idea of backstory, which I find grateful. I'm grateful for the idea that you have to. I've heard. I hear it. I just read it in a book proposal. In order to understand character, you have to know the whole biography, including every little thing. And I've never found those helpful. One thing you didn't mention that is in your book is the narrative psychology, and how that plays a role. That it isn't what happens to the character, the events in their life, it's how they interpret it and how it fits into the narrative that possibly I've heard predates, but by age 3, you've got some kind of narrative going based on primal relationships that you don't even remember later. And that's really what's important. What's important is how they, it's funny to me that we talk about storytelling versus character, but when you get to the depths of character, you find story anyway. You find the story the characters tell themselves about themselves and how that affects behavior. So I resonate with your with your approach in that sense too, that it's useful to think in the terms you're talking about with personality and how people view the world rather than what specifically happened to them in their past.
That's really interesting. Yeah. I wish I could remember. There's a really interesting study by Dan McAdams, I think one of the narrative psychologists, I'm pretty sure it was Dan McAdams, who talks about how, I think there are maybe 4, I'm not going to remember them, but when people tend to recap their own life stories, there are 4 genres that they typically, or they can be categorized into 4 different genres. And some people tend to tell much more kind of domestic romantic versions of their lives. Other people tell, these are going to be the far more interesting ones, but the way that we relay our life stories also fits genres, because of course it's reflecting what we're hearing in culture. And how revealing is that? I think I'm going to go back and look at that actually, because I think it's quite an interesting approach to, again, also understanding how a character thinks about themselves and the stories they tell themselves.
Yeah, well, I hope this isn't oversharing, but at one point, my wife asked my mother, what was I like as a little kid? And she said, when I was 2 years old, I would sit on the steps in front of the house and cry. And I just cried. And she couldn't figure out, nobody could know what was wrong. I don't remember this, and then my wife asked, well, how old was I when my sister was born? 2. So if you have one older brother and you're the baby, and the coin of the realm of a 2-year-old is attention, and suddenly they got another one, then that's going to mean, what is the narrative that you absorb? It's like, well, when one girl rejects you, then all girls reject you, and you ignore the ones that asked you out. You know what I mean? That shapes you when you're a teen. It shapes you when you're older. So I've personally experienced this whole, when you become aware, that's what psychotherapy is, becoming aware of a narrative that is tripping you up because there's no reality to it anymore. Anyway,
the tripping up is so interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, that's the flaw.
Fantastic. Anybody else who would like? Chris, do you have any questions or anything to add? Hello.
I'm a little bit under the weather, so I was foregoing you on my sleepy eyes for the whole session. That was really interesting, Kira. Thank you. I was thinking about the idea of the engaging character and the unengaging character, and like, is there a shortcut, a magic shortcut that I can use or that I can help my students to find? I was thinking about, I'm a very big Jacques Audiard fan, and there's something that about his male characters, particularly that I find very, very engaging. There's the male character in Rust and Bone, the Matthias Schoenaerts character. He's presented with these very, very positive qualities, like he's very loving and nurturing to his young son, but very they're allied with very negative characteristics as well. He's very immature, he's impulsive, he's got a temper, and he can even be violent towards his son. And the ODR has other similar characters who I find very, very compelling. I think the main character in the beat that my heart skipped is quite similar. And there's something that I'm drawn to with these characters to do with the seeing how good they could be, you know, and the way that they are not fulfilling that potential yet. And it's like I'm very passionately rooting for them to go to the good side, you know, fulfill your potential. And I was watching Schindler's List the other night for the first time in about 15 years, because I just thought I should go back and watch Schindler's List. And I'd completely forgotten loads of the film. And I thought that the introduction of the Oskar Schindler character was quite interesting, actually, because it was doing quite a similar thing that I had observed in the more kind of European art house context with ODR, which was he was being presented with these very powerfully positive characteristics, like very charismatic, very witty and charming and determined and resourceful and perceptive. He is almost a mythic character. People are like, that's Oskar Schindler, you know. But then at the same time, he's an opportunist who's benefiting from the war in quite a sort of calculated way. And I think there's a similar kind of potential thing going on with that character. You're like, look at the phenomenal positive qualities that this guy is exhibiting. Now he just needs to go, this is the good side over here, that's the bad side over there. He needs to go over here, you know? And certainly for me, I find that very, very compelling. And there are other kinds of characters that I find compelling too. But I wonder if there's something in that, the potential thing, being a shortcut to an engaging character.
That's super interesting. So I wonder whether I'm going to go back and watch those films. I can't remember any of them clearly enough, and those scenes at the moment to sort of recall and talk through them. But I'd be really interested to know whether your initial engagement is simply they're charismatic, and of course charismatic means we're charmed by them, we want to keep watching, and then presumably that deepens into when you discover the other side, the light versus dark side. Paul was talking about the triads there, and that complexity and as you're saying, this hope. I'd love to study. I'm going to go back and have a look at those and see how does our engagement with those characters change, because if they're initially charming and charismatic, then we're on just for that. But it sounds like it deepens and becomes more complex, and then that keeps you engaged, because it's obviously charming's never enough to keep one engaged that long. There's got to be more, and that can be intriguing as well, I suppose. So yeah, I think that sounds like a really interesting thing to go and study. I don't have any answers. Maybe you do.
No, only that it really, really works for me. That even where you mentioned the sideways character, that the cravenness of that moment in that script, that I find that drawing me to the character for that same reason, or at least drawing me to the drama, let's say, because I read the screenplay for Sideways recently, and I found that the character came off the page a lot more negatively to me than he came off the screen with the way that Paul Giamatti was playing him. And I guess there was just so much like vulnerability and humanity that Paul Giamatti was giving the character, that then when he does those, when he exhibits those negative traits, it really hooks me in to root for the character, I guess. Yeah.
To root for, and I feel to think keeping you engaged as well. It's revelation of more depth. It's something that surprises us. We learn about them. I think we are, watching characters and watching people to learn and to continue. We are prediction machines, so that informs us and our wider understanding of people and what they're like. So it's useful and therefore engaging.
Yeah, I think it taps into my inherent drive as a human being to go towards the good, Chris. Embrace the good. I've revealed my psychoanalysis of Chris for everybody.
Well, if I may, there's another example of a character I thought of that goes the other way, who's not charming at first, and then you have a contextual change of understanding of him. It's from an older movie called The Third Man. I don't know if anybody's seen this picture, but Major Calloway is brusque and he's rude, and he's the antagonist for the main character up until 2/3 of the way through. And then you see then a series of revelations occur that change the context. And now that's not a main character, that's different, but I think it's a good example. And in that case, it's about the manner at first. The first impression is negative, and then as you learn more information, you see how that his relentless drive to get somebody is a good thing. So.
Pretty interesting.
All right, fantastic. Rosamond, are you with us? Would you like to add anything or a question? Maybe. No. Okay, good. Well,
no, I'm sorry, I was just
there you are. It's fine. Hi.
I'm just finding my controls difficult to work. Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, no, it was really very very interesting discussion, really fascinating. I think, I mean, I find it, I've read your book, Kira-Anne, and I do find it very interesting, and I'm definitely find that approach to character very useful. But I also, I was struck by what Eugene was saying about that level of characters who are sort of opaque, who you don't, I mean, they possibly are functioning according to the sort of character traits that you laid out, Kira-Anne, but they're actually, we just don't see them, because that's the thing about the psychological realism is that we understand what's motivating the characters and how they are made up, whereas that sort of lower level doesn't mean, it's just about our as the audience, our understanding of them, that we're just, they are less transparent to us, which is how we are with other people in the world. They may all be functioning according to psychological theory and research, but we're not all psychologists. We don't necessarily understand that's what's going on. So, I think is more about the representation of the experience of character. It's just like making that distance, so making it more how actually in everyday life we experience character, which is we have no idea. We normally get it wrong as to what people, was actually going on inside other people. And I think, so it just really struck me that was interesting in relation to what Joachim was saying about theme, that maybe for some themes that you want to explore, that sort of level of character where it does remain opaque and we don't really understand, and the people don't really understand each other, works well for certain thematic themes. It works better than us understanding everything about the characters and who they are and why they're doing what they're doing. So I thought that was just struck me just from what other people were saying, that was a really interesting thing to think about. So yeah, I found it a really, really, really interesting discussion. Yeah, thank you so much, Anne, and thank you so much, Ramona, for organizing it, because it's what you had to say, Kira-Anne, was so interesting, but then also everyone else's responses and discussion was really fascinating too. Yeah.
I was just going to, that's just a really interesting point that you've made. And I was thinking, do we not understand people as well? So of course they're not transparent, but we are always trying to second guess other people, and sometimes
yeah.
I think quite often we probably do get it right, and just that second guessing is fascinating, isn't it? So yes, I but then arguably that opacity and that's just about the way that a character presents themselves, or that you as a writer write that character presenting themselves.
Yeah.
So
exactly.
And it's different from a stylization. That can be entirely realistic and not stylized. But yeah, I think just so many interesting questions around that and the things that people have brought up tonight. So thank you.
Well, anybody else who would like to come in and add or question anything at all? Yep.
I remember this interesting question about how much do we know people in life versus in movies. I remember reading a citation in one of David Bordwell's books. He cited a psychological study or a study in film theory that audiences have difficulty comprehending a story if they don't know the motive of the characters. If in other words, they see a series of things and it gets explained afterward, there's a lot less comprehension than if they know ahead of time what the character's motive is. And so that may play a role in why movies are the way they are, because you want people to pay attention, and that may bleed into the storytelling aspect versus the character aspect. But anyway, that's all I had to add. I'm sorry.
Well, it's welcome. It's all of it is very, very precious. Yes, Joaquin, come in.
This was a question I had in the beginning, but I left it out. But about knowing people and the curiosity, and goes to what Paul just said about knowing people's or characters' motives. And my sister once asked me, "Why do you keep the company of those friends?" And because I was at one time nagging a lot about how they were behaving. And I asked, well, I'm curious about them. That's the thing about them. I don't know their motives all the time. And when I'm nagging and like we're gossiping, it's all about trying to understand people. That's what I'm doing, trying to understand their motives. And that's when I guess when we get bored, like I don't want to be friends with you, Inshrin, again. I just don't like you anymore. And perhaps when we come to a conclusion about a person and we stop being curious about someone, we actually stop being engaged in the friendship and the relationship. And I think that goes a lot into our work when we work with our characters as well, that we need to build that curiosity as well. And that's Succession again. They're fantastic building that curiosity with Roman and well, a lot of them. And I don't understand their motives completely because they aren't complete yet, and hopefully will never be. Sadly, they will end. Sorry, long winding, me too being a bit affected by pollen.
It's fine. It's actually so interesting and so, useful, I think, for everybody. James, do you have any other word? Or Eugene, Danica, anybody, Monica?
I am all good, as they say here.
All right, good, great. Okay, Monica, any comment or any question from you? You're good. All right, then. Thank you again very much.
Thank you.
And
Thank you very much
I'm
indeed.
gonna stop the recording now. If I make it. Oh yeah.